Sometimes the cruelest thing isn't being abandoned, it's being told you deserve it. She was left to die because they decided her scars made her worthless. The railroad town threw her away like trash, leaving her broken body beside the tracks where no one would find her. They called her ugly. They said no man would ever want her. But when mountain man Elias Kane discovers her barely breathing in the dirt, he doesn't see what they saw. He sees a woman worth saving. In a time when a woman's value was measured only by her beauty, one man is about to prove them all wrong. What happens when the town learns she survived and that she's under his protection now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana mountain air had a particular quality in late October that Elias Kane had come to appreciate over his 8 years of solitude. It carried the scent of pine resin and the promise of snow, clean and sharp enough to make a man's lungs ache with the first deep breath of morning. He stood on the porch of his cabin, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the sun paint the eastern peaks in shades of gold and rose. Elias was 43 years old, though the mountain had aged him in some ways and preserved him in others. His hair had gone silver at the temples, but his body remained lean and strong from the daily work of survival. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and eyes, not from smiling, though he had smiled once, long ago, but from squinting into wind and sun and the vast distances that separated him from the world of men. His cabin sat in a small valley, protected on 3 sides by granite ridges that caught the worst of the winter storms. He'd built it himself, log by log, in those first desperate months after he'd fled civilization. The work had kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on things that couldn't be changed. Inside, the single room held everything a man needed and nothing he didn't. A stone fireplace, a narrow bed, shelves for his books and his worn leather journal, hooks for his traps and tools. He'd been a different man before this place. Before the fever took his wife Mary and their infant daughter in the span of 3 terrible days. Before he'd buried them in the town cemetery and walked away from the life he'd known, unable to bear the sympathy in people's eyes or the emptiness of the house they'd built together. The mountain had saved him, in its way. It asked nothing of him but respect and attention. It didn't offer false comfort or unwanted advice. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, and somehow that indifference had been exactly what he needed. His journal sat on the small table by the window, filled with careful sketches of the plants and animals he encountered. Documenting the world around him had become a meditation, a way of staying present when grief threatened to pull him under. The detailed drawings of elk tracks, pine cones, the precise arrangement of petals on a mountain wildflower, these things anchored him to the living world. But winter was coming, and even a man content with solitude needed certain supplies: salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, a few other necessities that couldn't be trapped or gathered, which meant a trip down to Copper Ridge, the railroad town that had sprung up in the valley below like a mushroom after rain, quick, opportunistic, and in Elias's opinion, poisonous to everything it touched. He'd been putting off the journey for 2 weeks, making excuses to himself. The weather was still good. He had enough coffee for another few days. The traps needed checking. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. He'd grown to despise towns and the people who filled them. The noise, the gossip, the way folks measured each other's worth by money and appearance, and things that didn't matter a damn in the world he'd chosen. Still, necessity was necessity. He saddled his horse, a patient roan mare named Steady, and began the long ride down the mountain. The descent took most of the morning. The trail switched back through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, past granite outcroppings where marmots sunned themselves in the autumn warmth. Elias noted everything with the observer's eye. He'd cultivated the tracks of a mountain lion near the creek, the signs that a bear had been digging for roots, the way the aspens had already dropped most of their golden leaves. As he descended, the sounds of civilization began to intrude. The distant whistle of a train, the rhythmic hammer of construction, voices carrying on the wind. His jaw tightened involuntarily. Copper Ridge sprawled along the railroad tracks like something that had been dropped there and never bothered to organize itself properly. False-fronted buildings lined a main street of churned mud. The station house, the largest structure, dominated the eastern end. Saloons, a general store, a hotel of dubious cleanliness, a blacksmith, and various other establishments crowded together in haphazard rows. The railroad had brought prosperity of a sort, but it had also brought the kind of people who followed opportunity without much caring what they trampled in the process. Elias had watched the town grow from his mountain perch with the same distaste he might watch a wound fester. He tied steady outside the general store and stepped inside, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dimness. The proprietor, a round man named Hutchins, looked up from his ledger. "Kane, don't see you but twice a year." "That's twice more than I'd prefer," Elias said, but there was no real heat in it. Hutchins was decent enough. For a town man, he gathered his supplies quietly, aware of the sideways glances from the two women shopping for fabric. They whispered behind their hands, the way people always did. The hermit, the strange one. That man who lost his family and went half wild in the mountains. Let them talk. Their opinions mattered to him about as much as last week's weather. While Hutchins tallied his purchases, Elias's attention was caught by a conversation at the front of the store. "Shameful is what it is," a woman was saying, her voice pitched to carry. "Walking around town like she has a right, with that face." "Her poor father," another replied. "Must have been a trial, raising a daughter who turned out like that. The accident was years ago. You'd think she'd have the decency to stay out of sight." Elias felt his hands tighten on the sack of flour he was holding. He'd heard this kind of talk before, the casual cruelty people inflicted on each other, and it never failed to disgust him. He didn't know who they were discussing, and didn't particularly care to find out. He just wanted to complete his business and get back to the clean silence of his mountain. "That'll be $8 even," Hutchins said. Elias paid, loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, and mounted steady. The ride back up the mountain couldn't come fast enough. But as he guided his horse past the railroad depot, something made him look toward the tracks. Maybe it was the odd stillness in that direction, or maybe it was simply the instinct that had kept him alive through hard winters and harder times. Whatever the reason, he turned his head and saw them. 3 men, standing in a cluster near the water tower. They were laughing, passing a bottle between them, and as Elias watched, one of them made a gesture, a dismissive, throwing away motion toward something beyond his line of sight. The men walked away, still laughing, heading back toward the saloon. Elias should have ridden on. Whatever business those men had been about wasn't his concern. He'd made a life out of not being concerned with the affairs of others. But something held him there. That gesture, that laughter. It had the quality of men who'd done something they were pleased with, something mean. He nudged steady forward, around the depot building, toward the tracks. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags someone had discarded. Then he saw the hand, pale against the dark earth, fingers curled like a bird's claw. Elias dismounted and approached slowly, his heart beginning to hammer in his chest, in a way it hadn't since the day he'd found Mary burning with fever. She was young, maybe 25, maybe younger, hard to tell in her current state. Her dress was torn and filthy, her dark hair matted with dirt and what might have been blood. But it was her face that would have stopped most people, that would have made them turn away or cross themselves or mutter a prayer. The left side of her face was a landscape of scar tissue, puckered and discolored, pulling her mouth into a permanent half-grimace. An old burn, he realized. Years old, healed as well as such things could heal, which wasn't well at all. She was barely breathing. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes, mercifully, were closed. For a long moment Elias Kane knelt there beside the railroad tracks, looking down at this broken woman someone had left to die, and he made a choice that would change everything. He'd thought he was done with caring, done with involving himself in the pain of others. He'd built a good wall around his heart, stone by stone, and it had served him well. But some walls, it turned out, weren't as strong as a man hoped. "All right," he said quietly, to her, or to himself, or maybe to whatever God might still be listening. "All right." He gathered her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel every bone, every sharp angle of her starving body, and clutched in her right hand, so tightly that her nails had cut into her palm, was a small silver locket. Elias settled her across Steady's saddle as gently as he could, then mounted behind her, holding her secure against his chest. She made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, but didn't wake. The afternoon sun was already dropping toward the peaks. It would be full dark before he reached his cabin, and the temperature would plummet. But Steady was sure-footed even in darkness, and Elias knew every foot of the trail. As he turned the mare's head toward home, toward the mountain, he found himself speaking to the unconscious woman in his arms. "You're going to be all right," he said. "I don't know who left you here or why, but you're going to be all right now." It was a promise he had no business making. But he made it anyway, and meant it. And that was how Sarah Coulter came to the mountain. The journey back up the mountain tested every bit of Elias's skill and endurance. The woman in his arms drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words he couldn't make out, sometimes going so still he had to press his fingers to her throat to feel the threadbare pulse beneath her skin. Each time he felt that flutter of life, he breathed a little easier. Steady picked her way up the darkening trail with the sure instinct of a horse who knew her way home. Elias kept one arm wrapped around the woman, the other holding the reins, his body curved protectively around her fragile form. The temperature dropped as they climbed, and he could feel her shivering despite the fever that burned through her torn dress. By the time they reached the cabin, stars had emerged in the black vault of sky overhead, hard and bright and indifferent as always. Elias dismounted carefully, lifting the woman down with him. She was so light it frightened him. How long had she been out there? How long since she'd eaten? He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him, and laid her on his bed, the only bed. The fire had burned down to embers, and he worked quickly to build it back up, needing light and warmth. As the flames caught and grew, shadows danced across the cabin walls and across the woman's ravaged face. Now, in better light, he could see the full extent of her condition. Beyond the scars, beyond the obvious starvation, she'd been beaten. Recent bruises mottled her arms, her throat. Her ribs showed through the torn fabric of her dress like bars on a cage. Dried blood crusted her hairline. Rage, clean and sharp, cut through Elias's carefully cultivated detachment. Someone had done this deliberately. Those men he'd seen by the tracks, laughing, they'd done this. He pushed the rage down. Anger wouldn't help her now. Action would. He heated water, gathered clean cloths, found the tin of salve he used for his own cuts and scrapes. Then, as gently as he'd ever done anything in his life, he began to clean her wounds. She stirred when the warm cloth touched her face, her eyes opening for the first time. They were brown, he saw, dark as creek stones, and full of terror so profound it stopped his hand mid-motion. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you." She tried to speak, but only a cracked whisper emerged. He held water to her lips, supporting her head, and she drank desperately, choking a little. "Slow," he murmured. "Slow now. There's plenty." Those dark eyes fixed on his face, searching for something. Threat, probably. Cruelty. The things she'd learned to expect. When she didn't find them, confusion flickered across her features. "Where?" The word came out broken. "My cabin. About 8 miles up from Copper Ridge. I found you by the tracks." Her expression shifted then, cycling through emotions too quickly for him to name them all. Fear, shame, something that looked almost like disappointment, as if she'd hoped not to wake up at all. Then her gaze dropped to her body, to her torn dress and exposed skin, and pure panic flooded her face. She tried to curl away from him, to cover herself, and the movement made her gasp in pain. "I haven't," Elias said quickly, understanding. "I was just cleaning your wounds. That's all. I'll get you something proper to wear." He moved to his trunk, pulled out one of his old shirts, soft from years of washing. When he turned back, she was crying silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her undamaged cheek. "Here." He held out the shirt, then turned his back to give her privacy. He heard the rustle of fabric, a sharp intake of breath that meant pain, and then finally a whispered word that might have been ready. She'd managed to pull on the shirt, though her hands shook so badly she hadn't been able to fasten more than 2 buttons. Elias buttoned the rest with brisk, impersonal efficiency, then helped her lie back down. She watched him with those wary eyes, like a wild thing waiting for the trap to spring. "What's your name?" he asked. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, Sarah Coulter. "I'm Elias Kane. You're going to stay here until you're well enough to travel, however long that takes." "Why?" The question was raw, genuine. "Why would you look at me? Look at my face?" Elias met her eyes steadily. "I see a woman who was left to die and deserves better. That's what I see." She turned her face away, fresh tears spilling. "You don't understand. They said, everyone said, I don't care what they said. You will. Once you know, Sarah." He waited until she looked back at him. "Right now, all I need to know is whether you can eat some broth. The rest can wait." He'd made the broth that morning, rabbit and wild onions, and he heated it now while she lay quiet in the bed. When he brought her a cup, she struggled to sit up, and he saw her notice her right hand for the first time. It was still clenched tight, the knuckles white. "What?" She stared at her own fist as if it belonged to someone else. "You were holding something," Elias said. "Wouldn't let go, even unconscious. Here." He gently pried her fingers open. The locket fell into her palm, tarnished silver catching the firelight. Sarah made a sound like a sob and a laugh combined, and pressed it to her chest. "I thought they'd taken it," she whispered. "I thought." Her fingers fumbled with the catch, and it sprang open. Inside was a photograph. Faded and water-stained, but still visible. A young girl, maybe 14, with a smooth, unmarked face and a shy smile. Long, dark hair, brown eyes, and an expression of such open, innocent hope that it made Elias's chest ache. "My father took it," Sarah said softly. "Right. Before the accident. I was 16. We'd just moved to Copper Ridge. Papa had a good job with the railroad, and I was going to help at the company house, cooking for the workers. I thought I'd meet someone, get married, have a family. I thought." Her voice broke. Elias waited. The water was boiling, a huge pot of it, for washing. I was carrying it across the kitchen, and one of the workers came through the door fast, not looking, and we collided. The pot went over, all of it, down my face and neck and chest. She touched the scarred side of her face with trembling fingers. I screamed for 3 days straight. The doctor said it was a mercy I survived, but I'm not sure it was. Papa tried. He truly did, but people started treating me different. The job offers stopped. Men who'd smiled at me crossed the street. Children pointed and cried. "Your father?" Elias asked quietly. "Railroad accident, 3 years ago. After that," she closed the locket with a soft click. "After that, the town decided I was a burden, a shame, something to be hidden away. They said I frightened people, that I was bad for business." The new railroad supervisor's wife led the campaign. Said I made her sick to look at me. Elias felt that rage again. Colder now. Harder. And today, he asked. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Today, they decided, I'd been a burden long enough. 3 men came to the boarding house where I'd been staying. Said the owner wanted me out. When I tried to explain I had nowhere to go, they dragged me to the tracks. Told me the morning train would solve everyone's problem. One of them called it a kindness. She met Elias's eyes then, and he saw something break open in her expression. Maybe they were right. Maybe it would have been a kindness. Because what kind of life can someone like me have? What man would ever want? Stop. The word came out harder than he intended. He gentled his voice. Sarah, stop. What they did to you was cruelty, pure and simple. Not kindness, not mercy, cruelty. And anyone who'd judge a person's worth by scars on their skin isn't worth your time or your tears. That's easy to say, she whispered, but you haven't had to live in this skin. You don't know what it's like when people won't meet your eyes, when they act like you're something unclean. You're right, I don't know that. Elias leaned back in his chair. But I know something about being left behind, about grief, about wanting to disappear into the wilderness because the world of people became too painful to bear. Sarah studied him in the firelight. You lost someone. Sarah, my wife, my daughter. Fever took them both 8 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. He stood, moved to bank the fire. But here's what I learned. Up here alone all these years, people down in that town, they're small, small in their thinking, small in their hearts. They need someone to look down on to feel better about themselves. But their judgment doesn't mean a damn thing to the mountain or the sky or the truth of who you are. He turned back to her. You rest now, get your strength back, then we'll figure out what comes next. Sarah's eyes were already drifting closed, exhaustion overwhelming even fear. But just before sleep took her, she whispered, Thank you. Elias settled into his chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and kept watch through the night. Every hour, he checked her breathing, her fever, the steady beat of her heart. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the shutters, promising the winter to come. He'd saved her life tonight. That much was done. But keeping her alive was only the first step. She'd need time to heal, and not just her body. She'd need safety, peace, a chance to remember that she was more than what cruel people had made her believe about herself. Elias looked at the woman sleeping in his bed, one hand still clutching the locket with the photograph of the girl she used to be, and made himself another promise. As long as she was under his roof, she'd know kindness, she'd know respect, and she'd never, not once, be made to feel like anything less than the human being she was. It was a small thing, maybe, but sometimes small acts of decency were the only weapons a person had against the cruelty of the world. And sometimes, if you were lucky, they were enough. December brought storms that isolated them completely. Snow piled higher than the cabin windows, and the wind howled down from the peaks with a voice like something ancient and hungry. But inside, the cabin was warm and bright, and Sarah and Elias moved through their days with an ease that felt almost like contentment. They'd become true partners in the work of survival. Sarah took over most of the cooking and mending, while Elias handled the heavier tasks, chopping wood, maintaining the traps that were still accessible, ensuring their food supplies would last through the worst of winter. They worked in harmony, anticipating each other's needs, communicating as much through gesture and glance as through words. One evening, after a particularly brutal storm had finally blown itself out, Elias pulled something from his trunk. It was wrapped in oilcloth, protected and preserved with care. When he unfolded the cloth, Sarah saw a beaded leather belt, beautiful work with patterns of blue and white and brown. I traded for this, he said, his voice quiet. 2 years ago, maybe 3. Met a Crow woman at the trading post. She'd made it for her daughter, but the girl had died. She said it deserved to be worn, not packed away with grief. He held it out to Sarah. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the belt. The beadwork was exquisite, and the leather was soft and supple despite its age. Elias, I can't. This is too much. It's been sitting in that trunk, doing nobody any good. Seems like it should go to someone who'd appreciate it. But you were saving it. She stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. You bought it for your wife. I did. He met her gaze steadily. But Mary's gone, and I think she'd want it to go to someone who needed to know they mattered, someone who'd been told too many times that they didn't. Sarah pressed the belt to her chest, tears spilling down both cheeks, the scarred one and the smooth one, equal in their grief and gratitude. I don't know what to say. Don't need to say anything. But she did speak, and what she said changed everything between them. I was engaged before the accident. Did I tell you that? Elias shook his head. Clayton Reeves. He was 22, working his way up in the railroad office, ambitious, handsome, everything a girl was supposed to want. Her laugh was soft and sad. We were going to be married in the spring. I had my dress half made, and then she touched her scars. He came to see me once, after, sat by my bed for maybe 10 minutes. I could see it in his face, the revulsion he was trying to hide behind pity. He said all the right words, said he'd stand by me, but his eyes were looking for the door the whole time. He left, sent a letter a week later saying he'd been offered a position in San Francisco and thought it best if we released each other from our promises. He made it sound noble, like he was setting me free. She smiled bitterly. Free to be alone, free to be invisible. That kind of free. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He was a coward. He was honest, in his way. They just weren't brave enough to say it out loud. She looked down at the belt in her hands. But you're different. You look at me and you just see me. Not the scars first. Not the tragedy. Just me. That's all there is to see. Sarah stood then, crossed the small space between them, and did something that stole the breath from Elias's lungs. She reached up and touched his face, her palm gentle against his bearded cheek. You're a good man, Elias Kane. Better than you know. He should have stepped back, should have maintained the careful distance they'd been keeping. But her hand was warm, and her eyes were full of something that looked like hope, and he found he couldn't move at all. Sarah, he said, and it came out rough, uncertain. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But when he didn't pull away, when his hands came up to rest on her waist, it deepened into something more. Something that spoke of loneliness and longing and the unexpected grace of finding another person who understood what it meant to be broken and still worth loving. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have. Don't. Elias cupped her face in his hands, careful of her scars, gentle as he'd learned to be. Don't apologize. Not for this. I know I'm not. I know men don't. Sarah. He waited until she met his eyes. You're beautiful. Not in spite of the scars or because of some noble blindness on my part. Just beautiful. Your strength, your kindness, the way you see the world, all of it. That's what I see when I look at you. She made a sound between a laugh and a sob and kissed him again. And this time there was no hesitation from either of them. They held each other there in the firelight, and Elias felt something he thought had died with Mary hope for a future that included more than just survival. Later, as they sat together on the bed, Sarah's head resting on his shoulder, she asked the question that had been building between them for weeks. What happens when spring comes? Elias was quiet for a long moment. I want to stay. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back and couldn't any longer. I know that's probably not what you planned. I know you came up here to be alone. But Elias, I've never felt as safe or as valued as I do in this cabin with you. Is that crazy? No. He turned to look at her. It's not crazy. Truth is, I've been dreading spring because it meant you might leave. Really? Really? He took her hand, threaded his fingers through hers. I came up here to escape the world. But you make me want to be part of it again. The good parts of it, anyway. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face in the lamplight. Not hiding the scars or trying to minimize them, but simply smiling, full and genuine and unashamed. So we stay together, she said. We make this work. We make this work. He agreed. That night, they lay together in the bed that had been hers alone, wrapped in each other and in blankets against the December cold. And for the first time since Elias had carried her broken body up the mountain, Sarah slept without nightmares. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent and endless. The mountain held them in its ancient hands, indifferent to human concerns, but offering shelter nonetheless. And in the small cabin on the edge of wilderness, two damaged souls found something neither had expected to find again. They found home. But winter's peace never lasts forever, and the world below has a way of finding those who thought they'd left it behind. In the small bedroom of a boarding house in Copper Ridge, a man named Clayton Reeves sat reading a letter, and his expression was cold enough to freeze fire. Sarah Coulter was alive, and she'd been seen with that mountain hermit, Cain. Clayton folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He'd been looking for Sarah for months now, ever since he'd returned from San Francisco with money and position and the news that her father's supposedly worthless mining claims were sitting on top of a significant silver deposit, the claims that were legally Sarah's, the claims that would have been his if she'd just stayed dead like she was supposed to. Clayton Reeves smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. He'd found her once, he could find her again, and this time he'd make sure things ended the way they should have in the first place. Winter deepened, and with it, the bond between Sarah and Elias. They moved through their days like two parts of a whole, each completing the other in ways neither had expected. The intimacy between them grew naturally, not just physical, though there was that too, but the deeper intimacy of shared silence and understood glances and the comfortable ease of two people who'd stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were. One morning in late January, Sarah was sorting through her few possessions, the torn dress she'd been wearing when Elias found her, cleaned and mended now, but still bearing the marks of what she'd endured. As she folded it carefully, something hard pressed against her palm through the fabric. She felt along the seam until she found the small tear in the pocket and pulled out an object she'd forgotten was there, her father's brass compass. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the tarnished metal in her palm. She'd thought this was lost, discarded with everything else when the town threw her away. But it had been with her all along, hidden in the folds of fabric, waiting. "Elias," she called, her voice unsteady. He came in from splitting wood, his face ruddy from cold and exertion. She held out the compass, and he saw the tears on her face. Papa's compass. He carried it every day of his life. It was his father's before him, brought all the way from Boston when the family moved west. She opened it with trembling fingers, revealing the inscription inside. "To James Coulter, may you always find your way home." I held onto my dress because it was all I had left from before. But I'd forgotten. Her voice broke. He gave this to me the day before he died. Told me it would keep me safe, help me find my way when I was lost. Elias put his arm around her shoulders. "Seems like it worked." Sarah leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "He died in a railroad accident. One of the bridges collapsed during a storm. They said it was nobody's fault, just bad luck and worse timing. But Papa was the engineer that day. He could have jumped clear, saved himself. But there were workers on that bridge, and he stayed at the controls, kept the train from going over completely, saved 6 men, died doing it. He was brave. He was. Everyone said so at his funeral. gave him a proper service, the railroad did, called him a hero. Her expression hardened. Then, 3 months later, those same people who'd praised him decided his daughter was too ugly to look at and needed to disappear. Elias felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. People have short memories for goodness and long ones for things that make them uncomfortable. I wish he could see this place. See us. Sarah turned in his arms to face him. He'd like you, I think. He valued honest work and honest men, and he always said a person's worth wasn't in what they looked like or how much money they had, but in how they treated others when nobody was watching. Wise man. Sarah kissed him then, soft and sweet, and they stood there in the cabin with her father's compass warm between their joined hands. That afternoon, Sarah asked Elias to take her to a place she could see the valley below. The weather had cleared enough for a walk, and she wanted to look down at the world she'd left behind. They climbed to a rocky outcrop about 1/2 mile from the cabin, the snow crunching beneath their boots. When they reached the summit, Sarah stood at the edge and gazed down at Copper Ridge, tiny and distant in the valley below. From up here it looks almost peaceful, she said, like it might actually be a place where people care for each other. Distance makes everything look better than it is. Do you ever miss it, the world of people? Elias considered the question. I miss what I thought it was, before I learned better. But the actual thing? No, can't say I do. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, I used to dream about leaving Copper Ridge, going somewhere nobody knew me, starting fresh. But I was too afraid. Afraid I'd just find the same cruelty somewhere else. That the problem wasn't the town but me. It was never you, Sarah. I know that now. She looked at him, her expression serious. Being here with you, I've learned something important. I spent so many years trying to make myself acceptable to people who were never going to accept me, trying to be smaller, quieter, less visible. But you've never asked me to be anything but myself. Scars and all. Elias took her hand. You're priceless to me, exactly as you are. Don't matter what anyone else sees or thinks. You're priceless. The words hung in the cold air between them, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not just gratitude or affection, but something deeper. Something that felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile country. I love you, she said simply. I don't know when it happened exactly, but I do. I love you. Elias pulled her close, and she felt him trembling slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I love you too. Never thought I'd say those words again, but I do. I love you, Sarah Coulter. They held each other there on the mountain, while the wind whispered around them, and the distant town remained blessedly far away. Two people who'd been broken by life and loss, finding strength in each other. But even as they stood there, wrapped in their newfound certainty, a rider was making his way up the mountain trail, and in his saddlebag was a wanted poster with Sarah's name on it, and charges of theft that had never happened, and a legal claim to property that wasn't his to make. Clayton Reeves had come for what he believed was owed to him, and he had the law, corrupt as it was, on his side. The peace that Sarah and Elias had built was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The question was whether their love would be strong enough to weather the storm that was coming. They had days left, maybe only hours, and they didn't even know it. They came on a Tuesday morning in early February, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the air held the promise of more snow. Elias was outside checking the traps when he heard the horses, multiple horses, moving up the trail with purpose. He'd learned to read the mountain's moods over 8 years, and right now it was telling him that trouble was approaching. He moved quickly back to the cabin, his rifle in hand, but held low and unthreatening. Sarah looked up from the stew she was stirring, saw his expression, and went pale. What is it? Riders. Coming up the trail. How many? 4, maybe 5. Could be nothing, but you don't think it is? No. Sarah set down the spoon with shaking hands and moved to the window. Together, they watched as the riders emerged from the tree line and approached the cabin. There were 5 of them, and even from a distance, Elias could see the glint of a badge on one man's chest, a marshal. And behind him, riding a fine black horse like he owned the mountain itself, was a man Elias didn't recognize, but Sarah clearly did. She made a sound like all the air had been punched from her lungs. Clayton. The riders stopped 20 feet from the cabin. The marshal, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered leather, called out, "Elias Kane, we need to speak with you." Elias stepped out onto the porch, Sarah behind him. "I'm Kane. State your business." The marshal shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. Behind him, Clayton Reeves sat calm and composed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm Marshal Grady. We're looking for a woman named Sarah Coulter. We have reason to believe she might be here." "And what if she is?" The marshal pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Then I'm authorized to place her under arrest for theft and fraud." Sarah's hand found Elias's arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. He could feel her shaking. "That's a lie," Elias said flatly. Clayton spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and educated. "Mr. Kane, I understand you may have been deceived. Sarah has always been quite skilled at playing on people's sympathies, but the facts are clear. She stole a significant sum from the railroad company money that was being held in trust for her father's final wages." "That's not true," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Papa's wages were paid. I never touched any railroad money." Clayton's smile widened. "Actually, the records show differently, and there's the matter of certain mining claims your father held, claims that technically became company property upon his death, as per his employment contract. Claims you've been attempting to sell without proper authorization." Elias felt Sarah stiffen beside him. "I didn't even know about any mining claims. Papa never mentioned them." "Of course not," Clayton said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Because they were worthless. At least, everyone thought they were, until recent geological surveys showed significant silver deposits in that area." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Quite valuable claims now, Sarah. Worth killing for, some might say." The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Elias. This wasn't about theft or fraud. This was about money and greed, and a man who saw Sarah as an obstacle to something he wanted. "She's not going anywhere with you," Elias said. Marshal Grady shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I have a warrant. If you interfere with a lawful arrest—" "Lawful?" Elias's voice was cold. "This man tried to have her killed. He had her beaten and left to die by those railroad tracks. Now he shows up with trumped-up charges and expects us to believe it's about justice? That's a serious accusation," Grady said. "Do you have proof?" "I have her testimony. I have the evidence of my own eyes, when I found her barely breathing in the dirt." Clayton shook his head sadly. "Sarah always was prone to dramatics. The truth is, she left Copper Ridge of her own accord after stealing the money. We've been searching for her for months. When one of my men spotted smoke from your cabin, we knew we'd found her." "Your men," Sarah said, and there was steel in her voice now. "You mean the 3 who dragged me from my room and left me to die?" "I have no idea what you're talking about. I've been in San Francisco for the past 6 months. I only returned when the company informed me of the theft and the mining situation." It was a lie, smooth and practiced, and Elias could see that Marshal Grady wasn't quite buying it either. But the man had a warrant, and he had 4 armed men behind him, and the law, however corrupt, was on his side. "Mr. Kane," Grady said, "I don't want trouble, but I have a job to do. Miss Coulter needs to come with us to answer these charges. If she's innocent, as you claim, the courts will determine that." "The courts that declared her mentally incompetent because of her scars?" Elias asked. "Those courts?" Clayton's mask slipped for just a moment, and Elias saw the cold calculation beneath. That was a medical determination made for her own protection. A woman who's been through what Sarah has, who looks the way she does, she's not capable of making sound decisions about complex financial matters. Sarah's laugh was bitter. There it is, the truth finally. I'm too ugly to be allowed to own property, too damaged to have rights. Sarah, Clayton began, but she cut him off. No, you had your chance to speak, Clayton. 8 years ago. You sat by my bed and told me you'd stand by me. Then you ran away the first chance you got. Now you come back because suddenly I'm worth something? Because my father's mining claims turned out to be valuable? She stepped forward, off the porch, and faced him directly. You're not taking me anywhere. Clayton's pleasant expression hardened. Marshal, do your duty. Grady sighed and dismounted. Miss Coulter, I'm placing you under arrest. Please come peacefully. Elias raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making his position clear. She's not going. The other 3 men hired guns, clearly reached for their weapons. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. Mr. Kane, Grady said carefully, you'll hang if you interfere with this arrest, and she'll still be taken. Is that what you want? Before Elias could answer, one of the other riders spoke up. He was younger than the others, with honest eyes and the look of a man uncomfortable with what he was seeing. Marshal Grady, sir. I got a question. Grady turned. What is it, Deputy Hayes? If this woman's supposed to be mentally incompetent, how come she's standing here making perfect sense? And if she stole money months ago, why are we just now bringing charges? And he looked at Clayton. If you were in San Francisco, sir, how come I saw you in Copper Ridge 3 weeks ago, meeting with those same 3 men who Mr. Kane says hurt Miss Coulter? Clayton's face went rigid. You're mistaken, boy. No, sir, I don't think I am. I remember thinking it was odd, you meeting with rough types like that, especially since you told everyone you were still in California. The marshal's expression changed, suspicion beginning to replace resignation. Is this true, Reeves? Of course not. The boy's confused, but Hayes shook his head. I wrote it in my log, sir, date and time. I can show you when we get back. The warrant in Grady's hand suddenly seemed less certain. He looked from Clayton to Sarah to Elias, and Elias could see the man doing calculations of his own. Hayes, you're certain about this? Yes, sir. Clayton's control was slipping now. This is ridiculous. Are you going to let a junior deputy's confused recollections interfere with official railroad business? Official railroad business, Sarah said quietly, or your personal business, Clayton, because I'm starting to see the difference. Grady folded the warrant and put it back in his coat. I think we need to sort some things out before any arrests are made. Mr. Reeves, I'm going to need to see the documentation on those mining claims, and the evidence of this supposed theft. Official documentation, not just your word. Marshal, your orders were clear. My orders were to investigate a theft and bring in a suspect if warranted. But if this whole thing is based on false testimony, then we've got a different situation entirely. He looked at Sarah. Miss Coulter, I'm not arresting you today, but this isn't over. You'll need to come to Helena, present your case to a judge. A real judge? Elias asked. Not one in Clayton's pocket? Judge Morrison. He's territorial, answers to the governor. He's as honest as they come. Clayton's horse shifted beneath him, sensing his rider's agitation. This is absurd. I have the law on my side. You have a warrant based on charges that are starting to look mighty suspicious, Grady said. And if Deputy Hayes is right about seeing you in town when you claim to be elsewhere, we've got a whole different investigation to conduct. Elias saw the moment when Clayton made his decision. The false pleasantness dropped away completely, replaced by cold fury. She's still ugly, he said, his voice venomous. Still worthless without those claims. You think anyone will side with her over me? You think any court will take her word over mine? I think, Elias said quietly, that you just showed everyone here exactly what kind of man you are. Clayton yanked his horse around. This isn't over, Not by half. He spurred his horse down the trail, the 3 hired guns following. Only Marshal Grady and Deputy Hayes remained. Grady looked at Sarah with something like apology in his eyes. "Miss Coulter, I'm sorry, but you will need to come to Helena when the judge is ready. Can I trust you to appear willingly?" "Yes," Sarah said. "I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not ashamed anymore. And I'm not going to let him steal what's rightfully mine." "Good." Grady tipped his hat. "Mr. Kane, you keep her safe until then. That's my intention." After they'd ridden away, Sarah and Elias stood in the silence, the magnitude of what had just happened settling over them like snow. "He's going to fight this," Sarah said. "He'll use every bit of his money and influence to—" "Then we'll fight back," Elias said simply. "We'll go to Helena, get a real lawyer, present the truth to a judge who isn't corrupt. And if we lose—" Elias took her face in his hands. "Then we'll figure something else out. But we're not giving up. Not now. Not after everything." Sarah nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes. And if he was honest, he felt it too. The storm was coming. And all they could do was prepare for it as best they could. They rode into Copper Ridge 3 days later, under very different circumstances than any of them had imagined. Marshal Grady led the way, with Elias and Sarah riding side by side behind him, and Tom and the other mountain men bringing up the rear. The wounded gunmen had been taken into custody, and their testimony had added to the growing case against Clayton Reeves. The town gathered as they rode down the main street. Some faces showed shame, others showed defiance, and still others just showed the blank curiosity of people watching someone else's drama unfold. Sarah kept her chin up, her eyes forward, refusing to hide or look away. They found Clayton at the railroad office, sitting behind a desk like he still owned the world. 2 of the governor's investigators were with him, going through ledgers and documents. When Sarah and Elias entered, escorted by Grady, Clayton's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. "This is absurd," he said, standing. "I'm a respected businessman. You can't possibly believe." "We have your ledgers," one of the investigators said calmly. "We have testimony from 3 different witnesses. And we have Miss Coulter's original documentation proving her father's mining claims were never company property." Clayton's eyes found Sarah, and the look he gave her was pure venom. "You think you've won something? You think anyone in this town will accept you? You're still hideous, still damaged. No amount of money changes that." Sarah stepped forward, and Elias saw the woman she'd become in these months, strong, certain, unashamed. "You're right," she said quietly. "Money doesn't change what I look like. But here's what you never understood, Clayton. I don't need your acceptance anymore. I don't need this town's acceptance. I know my worth now, and it has nothing to do with my face or your opinion." Brave words from a woman who's been living in the wilderness like an animal. "I've been living with a man who sees me as a human being. That's more than I ever got from you or anyone else in this town." Elias moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and supportive. Clayton's sneer deepened. "The hermit? Of course. What kind of man wants a woman who looks like that? Only a man who can't do better." Before Elias could respond, Sarah spoke again, her voice carrying throughout the room. "The kind of man who has character, who has integrity, who knows that love isn't about perfection, it's about seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway." She paused. "You had your chance with me, Clayton, when I was young and unblemished and everything you thought you wanted. And you ran. Not because I changed, but because you were too shallow to see past a surface that didn't matter. I had better prospects. You had greed and cruelty, and now you're going to have a cell." She turned to the investigators. "You have what you need." "We do, Miss Coulter." "Then I'm done here." Sarah looked one last time at Clayton. "I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine, because I'm not carrying your poison with me anymore." She turned and walked out, Elias beside her. Behind them, they heard Clayton's voice rising in anger and denial, but the words didn't matter anymore. They had no power. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Sarah saw the faces of people she'd known all her life. The shopkeeper who'd refused to serve her, the church ladies who'd suggested she worship at home, the mothers who'd pulled their children away from her on the street. And there, at the edge of the crowd, was the boarding house owner who'd let Clayton's men drag her away. The woman stepped forward, her face working. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I was afraid. He threatened my business," said he'd. She stopped, tears streaming. "There's no excuse. I should have protected you. I should have been braver." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. The old Sarah, the one who'd spent years absorbing cruelty and internalizing it, would have either lashed out or accepted the apology with meek gratitude. But this Sarah, the one who'd survived and fought and learned her worth, knew there was a third way. "You should have been braver," she agreed, "and I hope next time you will be. When someone else needs help, when someone else is being hurt, I hope you remember this moment and make a different choice." The woman nodded, still crying. Another voice called out from the crowd, "Miss Coulter, wait." It was the blacksmith, a burly man named Henderson, who'd never been cruel to her, but had never been particularly kind either. He held something in his hands. "I made these," he said, holding out 2 simple gold bands. "Wedding rings. I heard you and Mr. Kane were likely to marry. Consider them a gift, an apology maybe, for not standing up when I should have." Sarah took the rings, feeling the weight of them, the simple beauty of honest craftsmanship. "Thank you," she said. "These are lovely." Henderson nodded, looking relieved. "You deserved better from us, from all of us." "Yes," Sarah said simply. Not everyone in the crowd looked ashamed. Some still stared at her scars with revulsion or pity. But Sarah found she didn't care. Their opinions no longer had the power to wound her. She turned to Elias, who'd been watching her with quiet pride. "Can we go home now?" she asked. He smiled. "Yes, let's go home." They mounted their horses and rode out of Copper Ridge with their heads high. Tom and the other mountain men rode with them for a while, then peeled off at various points to return to their own cabins, their own lives. But each one stopped to shake Elias's hand and nod respectfully to Sarah before they left. "You've got good friends," Sarah said, as she and Elias rode alone up the trail toward their mountain. "We've got good friends," Elias corrected. "They stood for both of us." The cabin appeared through the trees as the sun was setting, golden light streaming through the pines. It looked exactly as they'd left it, small, simple, perfect in its way. But as they dismounted and walked toward the door, Sarah saw something new. On the porch, someone had left a basket. Inside were supplies, fresh bread, preserves, a smoked ham, and a note. Sarah unfolded the note and read aloud, "From your neighbors on the mountain, welcome home." She looked at Elias, her eyes bright. "They left us gifts. Mountain folks take care of their own," he said, "and you're one of us now." That night, they sat by the fire, the 2 gold rings resting on the table between them. Sarah picked one up, turned it in the firelight. "When should we use these?" she asked. Elias took her hand. "Whenever you want. Tomorrow. Next week. Next year. I'm not going anywhere." "Tomorrow," Sarah decided. "I want to be your wife tomorrow." "Then tomorrow it is." They held each other as the fire burned low, and the mountain settled into its evening quiet. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere far below, Copper Ridge carried on without them. But up here, in this cabin at the edge of the world, 2 people who'd been broken by cruelty and healed by love, prepared for the next chapter of their lives, together. 3 months later, the mountain wore its summer colors like a celebration. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in waves of purple and yellow and white. The streams ran full with snowmelt, and the air carried the scent of pine and possibility. Sarah stood on the porch of their cabin, and it was truly theirs now, in every sense, watching Elias work in the small garden they'd planted together. She wore the beaded belt he'd given her that winter, and on her left hand, the simple gold ring Henderson had forged gleamed in the afternoon sun. They'd married the day after returning from Copper Ridge, with Tom and his wife as witnesses and the mountain as their cathedral. No fancy ceremony, no crowd of well-wishers, just two people making promises they intended to keep. The mining claims had proven as valuable as Clayton had believed. Sarah had sold them to a mining company out of Helena for enough money to secure their future several times over. But they'd chosen to keep their life simple. The cabin had been expanded slightly, a separate bedroom, a better stove, windows that let in more light, but it was still fundamentally the same place where Elias had brought her all those months ago. Some things had changed, though. They'd bought land, secured their claim to the mountain valley they called home, and they'd opened their door to others. Twice now, they'd taken in people fleeing bad situations, a widow with 2 children escaping an abusive son-in-law, a young man running from a crime he hadn't committed. They'd offered shelter, supplies, and the same kind of uncomplicated acceptance Elias had first shown Sarah. Paying it forward, Sarah called it. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. A small group was riding up the trail, Marshal Grady, Deputy Hayes, and a woman Sarah didn't recognize. Mrs. Kane, Grady called as they approached, tipping his hat. The title still gave Sarah a warm feeling, even months after the wedding. Marshal, Deputy, welcome. Elias came around from the garden, wiping his hands on his pants. The 3 riders dismounted, and the woman stepped forward. She was young, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and a bruise yellowing on her cheek. "This is Miss Elizabeth Chen," Grady said. "She's in a situation similar to what you faced, Mrs. Kane. Different specifics, but the same kind of trouble, a man with money and influence trying to force her into something she doesn't want." Sarah understood immediately. She stepped forward and took the young woman's hand. "You're safe here. For as long as you need." Relief flooded Elizabeth's face. "Thank you. They said you'd understand, that you'd help. We do, and we will." Sarah looked at Grady. "Clayton, still in prison, will be for years. But he's not the only cruel man in the territory, unfortunately." "No," Sarah agreed. "He's not." After Grady and Hayes left, Sarah settled Elizabeth in the cabin's spare room and brought her tea. The young woman's story spilled out a forced engagement, threats against her family, the slow realization that she had to run or be trapped forever. "I thought I was being a coward," Elizabeth whispered, "running away." "There's nothing cowardly about refusing to let someone else control your life," Sarah said firmly. "You're brave. Don't let anyone tell you different." That evening, the 3 of them sat around the dinner table. Elias, Sarah, and Elizabeth and Sarah saw her younger self in the frightened woman across from her, but she also saw strength there, waiting to be recognized and claimed. "How long did it take you," Elizabeth asked, "to stop being afraid?" Sarah considered the question. "I'm still afraid sometimes, of different things than before, but fear doesn't just vanish. What changed was that I learned fear doesn't have to control me, that I could be afraid and still act, still choose." Elias added, "And sometimes having someone stand with you makes all the difference. You're not alone in this, Miss Chen." Later, after Elizabeth had gone to bed, Sarah and Elias walked down to the place where she'd first asked to see the valley below. The town lights were visible in the distance, tiny and inconsequential from this height. "Do you ever miss it?" Elias asked. "The town, the people, the life you had before?" Sarah shook her head. "I miss my father. I miss who I was before the accident, sometimes not because of how I looked, but because of how simple things seemed then. But the town? The life I was living? No, that wasn't living. It was just existing, and barely that." She turned to face him, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson behind her. "This is living. Helping Elizabeth is living. Working beside you every day, building something real that's living. I wouldn't trade it for anything." Elias pulled her close. I spent 8 years thinking I wanted to be alone, convinced myself I was better off without anyone. Then you came along and proved me wrong about everything. I'm sorry I ruined your solitude, Sarah said, but she was smiling. Best thing that ever happened to me, that ruining. They stood there as the sun sank below the peaks, wrapped in each other and in the life they'd built from broken pieces. The mountain breeze whispered around them, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers and home. A week later, Sarah rode down to the railroad tracks where Elias had found her. She hadn't been back since that terrible day, but she needed to see it now, needed to reclaim that space. The tracks looked the same, iron rails stretching into the distance, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded beside them. But Sarah had changed. She dismounted and walked to the exact spot where she'd lain waiting to die. And she stood there in the sunlight, her scars visible and unashamed, and felt nothing but gratitude for the man who'd seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself. She pulled her father's compass from her pocket. She carried it always now and opened it. The inscription still read, "May you always find your way home." "I found it, Papa," she whispered. "It's not what I expected. It's better." She closed the compass, mounted her horse, and rode back up the mountain toward Elias, toward Elizabeth who needed help, toward the life she'd built from ashes and courage and love. Behind her, the railroad tracks stretched on, empty and cold. But ahead, up the mountain, smoke rose from the cabin chimney, and Sarah could see Elias standing on the porch, waiting for her. Home. She'd finally found her way home.